problem. Okay. I'm Ellen Levy. I'm a board member of the World Affairs Council of West Michigan, and I'm the chair of the Great Decisions Committee. We are very happy to welcome you to our first of this year's series, 2011. Okay, any other requests? Okay, can you hear me now? I want you to be able to hear. Thank you. We have been a local sponsor of this series for 50 years, and we have the largest Great Decisions lecture series in the United States. So we're very excited about that. So welcome to our members, our guests, and students. How many of you here are currently members of the World Affairs Council? Just to show. Oh, that's terrific. Thank you very much. How many of you are taking Great Decisions for college credit, or not for credit, just taking the class? Wonderful. Thank you. One of the colleges that offers our series as a credit course is Kendall College of Art and Design of Ferris State University. We're delighted and honored to have the president of Kendall with us this evening, Dr. Oliver Evans. Dr. Evans, are you in the room at the moment? Please stand. Thank you very much. We'd also like to extend a warm welcome to non-members in the audience. Our events are open to the public, and we're glad you're here. You may sign up in the lobby for an email reminder of our events if you would like to do that. But we hope you will join. Member information is also outside on your way out. Yeah, one of the benefits you receive as a member is special pricing for the series, and we hold over 25 events a year. Just to remind you, there are 8 policy issues for discussion each year. This is a nationwide program, and everyone that takes part in the series studies the same topic. That's why you will have noticed a ballot in your program. Please express your opinion on the topic tonight and put your ballot in the box on the way out. The results are compiled and shared with President Obama and Mrs. Clinton, the Secretary of State. Please make your voice heard. Let me also thank Grand Rapids Community College, a longtime partner with Council and tonight's evening sponsor. Thank you very much. Now, to our special guest and topic this evening. Americans want their government to address the threats of terrorism at home and rogue states acquiring nuclear weapons. Of the 3 main choices, doing nothing, doing something, or going to war, most argue for doing something, but something short of war. Do something, but not too much, often translates to levying sanctions, a form of economic coercion. Sanctions may be the best available option, or in some cases, the only option. We should have an interesting discussion on this tonight. As most of us are NPR junkies, we look forward to our tradition of leading off the Great Decisions series with a correspondent from NPR. So, here to introduce Mike Schuster, our special guest this evening, is Lindsay Smith from Michigan Radio, our media sponsor. Lindsay.
Thank you. I'm short as well. I'll hold on to this. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm Lindsay Smith. I'm the West Michigan reporter for Michigan Radio. Can you hear me okay? Yes. A little bit closer. Yes. Okay. Hi to everyone in Holland, I believe, that's streaming this. Yes. I want to thank you so much for being here, Mike Schuster. I appreciate it. Michigan Radio is proud to be a media sponsor for the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's Great Discussion Lecture Series. I wanted to make sure I didn't mess it up, but it really is a great opportunity to discuss American foreign policy, I think, like none other, and Michigan Radio loves to be a part of that. This is an opportunity. Later this month, our senior political analyst, Jack Lessenberry, will be here to discuss the global financial crisis, so looking forward to that one as well. We're very pleased to have Mike Schuster here with us tonight. Mike has been with NPR for 30 years. Racking up a resume that a journalist and a political science major like me will be envious to one day have ever. He's covered the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany. He's covered Iran's nuclear program. He's covered the attacks on 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. His reporting has won him numerous awards. It's brought him to Iran, Zimbabwe, Pakistan, Moscow, more. Please join me in welcoming NPR's foreign correspondent, Mike Schuster.
Now, I think I don't need this microphone because there's one. The one on me is working. Is that correct? Yeah. Yes. Everybody can hear. Okay. All right, so I don't need to be too close to that microphone, I think. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and thanks for inviting me to talk to you about this subject tonight. I want to warn you first, though, that I don't consider myself an expert in this field. I don't actually consider myself an expert in anything. I don't think that journalists really become experts. Journalists work hard to understand complex subjects sometimes, and this is a complex subject. And journalists work hard to be able to put it into a coherent form so that it's communicated to the consumers of news, you all who listen to our program. So I work hard to make sense out of it to myself, and then to put it in a form that's accessible to those who tune into our news programs. But it's also true, having said that, that I've been focused on these topics for 20 years, essentially. I've been a roving foreign correspondent for NPR for the past 20 years, more than 20 years now. And they send me out to different parts of the world, mostly to participate in NPR's coverage of conflicts. And when I'm not traveling, I stay at home and I work at U.S. foreign policy. And this issue of nuclear proliferation is just something that I think growing up as a young person at the height of the Cold War, it was something that naturally attracted me, and so I've worked hard to make a lot of sense of it. Now, the topic is economic sanctions. There have been economic sanctions going back in the history of the United Nations that have been used to try to change the behavior of states that may have violated human rights standards, like South Africa for many years, or Rhodesia before it became Zimbabwe. That's not what I'm going to talk about tonight. What I'm most interested in is the last 20 years of experience with economic sanctions, both those that have been imposed by the United States and those that the UN has imposed, to change the behavior of states that appear to look like they want to acquire nuclear weapons. And so we have since 1991, we've got three really interesting cases. We have Iraq in the 1990s up until the 2003 US invasion of Iraq. We have the issue of North Korea, and we have Iran. Put them all together and you get the axis of evil that was the notion that George W. Bush put forward in his State of the Union speech in 2002. And in fact, these are three states that concern the United States because of their interest in acquiring nuclear weapons. So let's start with Iraq first. Well, maybe I should broaden the framework. The issue is, can economic sanctions imposed unilaterally or multilaterally change the behavior of states that appear to want nuclear weapons? Can it put them off from them? Can they come to a different conclusion and renounce them? Are they an effective tool? And as a result, is that a way of preempting war? Because there is much talk about the use of military action, particularly in the Iranian case, to destroy some, the assumption is not all, of Iran's nuclear facilities. So that's the big question in front of us. And the three case studies are very interesting in this respect. And in a certain degree, they lead to different answers and a certain ambiguity about the big question. Iraq, of course, invaded Kuwait in 1990 and was ousted from Kuwait in 1991 by the United States, working with a coalition of other states, but mostly by US forces. And in 1991, once that occurred, the UN imposed economic sanctions and an oil embargo on Iraq until it came clean on all of its weapons of mass destruction. And it was assumed, and there was good reason to believe, that at that time, Saddam Hussein was interested in acquiring nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and chemical weapons, and that there were programs like that in Iraq. And so the United Nations and the International Atomic Energy Agency took on the job of inspecting Iraq and trying to answer all the unknown questions about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, and ultimately to destroy or dismantle the programs that were involved in WMD in Iraq. And that's precisely what occurred in Iraq between 1991 and 1998. The International Atomic Energy Agency went in and found evidence that Iraq was pursuing nuclear weapons and destroyed it. They didn't destroy the knowledge that Iraqi scientists had acquired, but they did preempt the program. They stopped the program. Other inspectors from the United Nations who were experts in biological weapons discovered that in fact there were programs involving anthrax, botulinum toxin, other really horrible things, and that the Iraqis were experimenting with biological weapons and similarly with chemical weapons. And they destroyed a great deal, a large portion of those programs. The first time I went to Iraq was in 1996. That was the same year that the UN inspectors actually dynamited a place in Iraq, which at a place called Al-Hakam, which was where the biological weapons programs were concentrated. And that's one of the things I reported on when I went to Iraq in 1996. So this work continued, but Saddam Hussein and his government didn't want to divulge all the information. They played a cat and mouse game with UN weapons inspectors until 1998. And then in 1998, then President Clinton got fed up with what Iraq was doing and essentially laid down a marker and said, if you don't come fully clean on these weapons programs, then you're going to endure another bombing campaign. And in February of 1998, Clinton carried out the threat. What's really interesting about this is that so the effort to end the weapons programs in Iraq was initially the work of sanctions and a more complete oil embargo, but ultimately the government of the United States resorted to military action in order to stop this. What we got instead was blindness in Iraq. As a result of that bombing campaign, which was very short-lived, some facilities were destroyed. The weapons inspectors were withdrawn for their own safety, and Saddam Hussein never let them back in again. So between 1998 and 2003, as a result of the military action, we went blind in Iraq. We didn't know what was going on in Iraq. And it's probably true that to a certain degree, some weapons programs continued. What's more important is by the time we get to 2003 with George W. Bush in office and he and his close advisors hell-bent on going to war in Iraq, they didn't know and we didn't know what the state of weapons programs, weapons of mass destruction was in Iraq. And the Bush administration made the argument to the American people and to the wider world that Saddam Hussein was reconstituting his dangerous weapons, particularly nuclear weapons, and that this was the reason why the United States had to invade Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein from power. As we all know, that turned out to be wrong. We were blind in Iraq for 5 years, and then we went into Iraq to use military force on the pretense of destroying these weapons, and it was all wrong. The Bush administration had gotten it all wrong. I think the reason the Bush administration got it all wrong was because weapons inspectors weren't there for 5 years, and we didn't have the regular reports that they make to governments and ultimately to the people of the world about the dangerous cases that they focus on. You may remember that as a result of pressure from other states, particularly in Europe, the Bush administration gave in to the demand that the issue first be taken up by the UN Security Council. And the UN Security Council said, all right, before any military action is taken, let's send the inspectors who know the terrain and who knew the situation in Iraq back and see what they find. And you may remember that by that time, the International Atomic Energy Agency was run by Mohammed al-Baradei, an Egyptian international civil servant who now turns out to be, interestingly enough, playing a significant role in the events that are taking place in Egypt over the last couple of weeks. Al-Baradei, to my mind, is one of the finest international civil servants who's ever served, and he ran the IAEA for many years. And he played a very important role in the run-up to the war in Iraq. inspectors went in, they went to places that they knew had been facilities or sites or associated with the nuclear weapons program in Iraq before. They gathered their evidence, they talked to scientists, they knew the terrain, they knew the questions to ask, and they knew whom to ask. And they came back to the Security Council before the invasion, and they reported several times to the Security Council that there was no reconstitution of a nuclear weapons program in Iraq. Further, you may remember there was an episode involving some documents that alleged that Saddam Hussein had surreptitiously sought to acquire large amounts of uranium from Niger, and that this even found its way into President Bush's State of the Union speech in 2002, in 2003, a few months before the invasion. And al-Baradei said it openly in the Security Council, these were forged documents and this was not true. But there wasn't a constituency in the United States that was eager to hear this kind of thing. The Bush administration countered by saying that al-Baradei and the inspectors had been duped, and we went to war. Then we found out afterwards that al-Baradei and his inspectors were right. So we have this case study of Iraq from 1991 to 2003, where initially sanctions and the trade embargo on Iraq held. We learned it gave the opportunity to the International Atomic Energy Agency to find out what it could, and it found out a lot about those weapons programs, to destroy or dismantle what it could, and it did a lot of that. But then warfare was chosen anyway. Military action was chosen in order to, in the mind of President Bush and his advisors, to end those programs once and for all. And we know what ensued from that. So that's one case. The second case is North Korea. And this also was playing out initially in the 1990s. But it was different. It wasn't such a secret any longer in Korea. The issue was what to do about a state that essentially was more open about seeking nuclear weapons, even if it was part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and had agreed not to do that before. In 1994, it became known publicly that North Korea had built a complex of industrial facilities that could make plutonium in a place called Yongbyon, and that they were reprocessing nuclear waste into plutonium, and they were making bombs. There was a belief that they had reprocessed enough plutonium for a couple of nuclear weapons, and that they were seeking a nuclear weapons capability. At that point, the advisors to President Clinton got together and said, all right, this is unacceptable. We have to face up to the possibility that there would be military action to stop them from doing that. And then the Clinton administration threatened that against North Korea. North Korea at that point was shaken enough, and this was soon after the end of the Cold War. The situation in North Korea was unstable. Internally, it wasn't clear that the North Koreans had any more allies, as they did during the Cold War with the Soviet Union and China. And so the North Koreans blinked and decided to enter into negotiations with the United States. And an agreement came out that essentially froze the plutonium program in North Korea. This was known somewhat unartfully as the agreed framework between the United States and North Korea. But it was a very significant agreement, even if it was a little bit vague and unspecific in parts. The agreed framework essentially froze the plutonium program in North Korea indefinitely. And the North Koreans carried out this part of, at least initially, this part of the agreement. So they stopped making plutonium, and therefore they stopped acquiring the key ingredient to make more nuclear weapons. On the other side, the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Russia, I believe, their job was to build a nuclear reactor that was less inclined to proliferate toward weapons that the North Koreans wanted in order to build up their electricity grid. They needed power, and this was the deal. And the United States and Japan and South Korea started financing that, and it started to be built actually in North Korea. All the while, for a number of years, the North Koreans stopped their production of plutonium. So there was not a need to threaten warfare at that point. There was a need to carry out this agreement. But the Clinton administration came to the conclusion that the North Korean regime was not going to last, that they didn't have to pay close attention to this agreement because in the mid-1990s, the state of North Korea was undergoing a very severe internal economic crisis. There was widespread famine, and it looked like the North Korean government was going to collapse. And so the Clinton administration didn't do that much to fulfill its end of the bargain. And by the late 90s, the North Koreans, still in power, had decided, all right, if they're going to do that, we're going to cheat. And they cheated. They initiated in the late 90s a program using highly enriched uranium to make bombs, which is an easier route to bombs than plutonium. Actually, to this day, we don't have a full accounting of what the highly enriched uranium program in North Korea is. Recently, they've essentially acknowledged that, yes, they are pursuing highly enriched uranium as the ingredient for a bomb. But in the meantime, they were using plutonium, and they were willing to discuss this, but they really wanted the agreed framework to be carried out. Clinton leaves office in 2001, and George W. Bush takes over. And one of the first meetings that occurs between President Bush and a foreign leader is with South Korea in, I think, March of 2001, just 2 months or so after George Bush becomes president. And Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, comes out with the then president of South Korea, and he makes a statement that says there were some good things about the Clinton administration's agreed framework with North Korea. We're going to continue them, and we're going to apply sanctions that we call smart sanctions that won't hurt the people of North Korea, but that could put pressure on the military and the elite in North Korea to stop pursuing nuclear weapons. And essentially, George Bush said, oh no, that's not the case. And Colin Powell, I think this was one of the first humiliations that he experienced in public. And what happened after that is that the Bush administration took what they considered to be evidence of North Korean cheating to the North Koreans and accused them of doing just that. And the process fell apart. The North Koreans withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They declared the agreed framework no longer valid. They threw out the weapons inspectors because the IAEA had kept specialists in North Korea the whole time to monitor the freeze. And by 2003, we were blind again, but this time in North Korea, we didn't know really what was taking place. Now, there has been a lot of back and forth about negotiating with North Korea since then. But in addition, what happened is that the North Koreans actually did make bombs and explode them. In 2006 and then again in 2009, the North Koreans tested nuclear weapons. They built an underground test facility in the northeast of North Korea. They exploded the first bomb in, I think, October of 2006, and then they did it 3 years later in the spring of 2009. And then they essentially said, all right, we're part of the nuclear club. What this did is it really got the U.S. attention, but I think it really rattled the public here a great deal, that all of a sudden a state that really has been perceived for more than half a century as an enemy of the United States had gotten some capacity to explode a nuclear weapon. Now, the weapons, the bombs that they actually tested didn't turn out to be much, at least from the perspective of a nuclear weapons specialist. Some of the experts here in the United States said it was actually a fizzle. That is, it did not yield the kind of power that should have yielded given the amount of plutonium that was in the bomb. And they had similar difficulties in 2009, which can lead specialists in the United States to say that they're having problems with their bomb design and the material that they're using, but nevertheless, they got a nuclear explosion to go off. As a result of that, what happened is that the United States decided that, okay, the North Koreans want to negotiate with us. will have a bigger negotiation that became known as the six-party talks. It involved the United States, the two Koreas, China, Japan, and Russia. And those have been on again, off again talks that unfortunately have gone nowhere. The Bush administration was divided on whether to participate in these talks. Some in the State Department wanted to do it, mostly Dick Cheney and others in the Vice President's office, and some in the State Department didn't want to do it. It didn't go very far. There was a moment, I think in 2007, when it looked like there was going to be a breakthrough, and in fact, the United States had upped the demands by saying North Korea must dismantle and destroy its nuclear facilities, and they did do some of that. They spiked some of the industrial facilities, and they blew up a cooling tower in the Yongbyon nuclear facilities compound, and that was on international television. So it looked like there was some movement, but it never got as far as it could have. And we're still in an unusual limbo with North Korea. Always very nervous when there's rumors that the North Koreans might set off another weapon, or that they might try to test a long-range rocket, and there's always talk about how close they may come to being able to put rockets together with warhead, and how close their long-range weapons could get to the United States. This is an ongoing issue, and I'm sure you've all heard at least something about it. What's important in terms of the framework that we're trying to talk about tonight is that the issue of attack on North Korea is taken off the table. Essentially, the North Koreans have been fearful of the United States. I think it's fair to say this, have been fearful of the United States since 1953 when a truce was established, and have been hostile to the United States. And you may know that there is a very tense border between North Korea and South Korea with a lot of military hardware on either side, the demilitarized zone. And the North Koreans and the South Koreans are afraid that war could break out. The North Koreans in particular have said over and over again they're afraid that the United States would use nuclear weapons to destroy the regime in Pyongyang. That may sound ridiculous to an American audience, but that's what the North Koreans believe, and I think it's fair to say that they decided to acquire nuclear weapons for primarily one reason, and that's to deter the United States from attacking North Korea. And I think that's what they got. The question of military action against North Korea and to take out its nuclear facilities has been removed from the table. It's removed from the table a long time ago. This is not an option for the United States because of fear that the North Koreans could retaliate with nuclear weapons, as well as conventional weapons, because they have so much artillery and rockets along the border with South Korea, the demilitarized zone, and those artillery shells can reach Seoul. It's only about 30 miles from the demilitarized zone, and it's vulnerable. It's a big, thriving, fascinating city of many millions of people, and it's vulnerable to North Korean attack. So what you have is a situation where one side deters the other, and the other side deters the other, and we're in a stalemate on North Korea. So, two cases with two different results, Iraq and North Korea. Now, let's take a look for a minute at Iran, because Iran is the case that we hear the most about. And it's the one that we hear the most talk about using military action in order to destroy the nuclear facilities there. So the question is posed to us, is this a good idea? Is it necessary, and is this a good idea? We learned initially of Iran's secret steps to build a facility to enrich uranium in 2003. The original information, it's not entirely clear where the original information came from, but the International Atomic Energy Agency, under Mohammed al-Baradei, sent in weapons inspectors to Iran. Iran had to accept them because Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and has what's known as a safeguard agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. So it was all lawful and legal under international law. And the IAEA discovered that they were building a secret facility to enrich uranium. This was in 2003, and they've expanded over, in the 5 years after that, 5 or 6 years after that, they expanded this facility, built more and more of these gas centrifuges that you may hear about in the news, which spin very fast and can separate isotopes of uranium, in particular, separating out the isotope that's highly fissionable, that is, splits easily, and can be used for the raw material to power nuclear reactors, to generate electricity, and in another form, a more highly enriched form, can become the core of a nuclear weapon. The IAEA has been able to trace the development of these facilities in Iran because Iran has not broken with the IAEA. It is legal, and Iran must accept regular visits by weapons inspectors, even surprise inspections in some cases where the Iranians don't get advanced word of where the inspectors want to go. And this takes place probably every week, certainly every month. And then they keep track of what they know about the program, and they deliver every 3 months for the last 4 or 5 years. The IAEA has delivered a report to the member states of the IAEA, and that usually tends to become public within seconds as soon as the report is released to the member states. And so we've been reporting, and I've been reporting on these reports and keeping track of the details of the nuclear weapon. That's a mistake. The nuclear program that may be a nuclear weapon program in Iran. There, as you know, has been a lot of tension about this, particularly involving Israel. The leaders of Israel have been saying for many years now that the Iranians are only a couple years away from acquiring nuclear weapons. That has proven to be serially untrue because they started saying this in the late 90s, and when they started saying in 1997 they'd have the bomb by 1999, and then they got to 1999 and they said they'll have the bomb in 2001, and so on and so on and so on. There's reason that Israel should be worried about Iran having nuclear weapons, but their predictions have not come true. Lately, something else has occurred, and this raises even more questions about military action, the usefulness of military action. As we haven't gone to war with Iran. We've threatened it. There's a lot of talk about it, but we've used sanctions and, to some degree, diplomatic engagement, although that's been futile, I think, so far. But something has happened in the last year and a half that we're only now learning about, and that's that Iran's nuclear activities have been sabotaged. And they were sabotaged starting in 2009 and into 2010. And over the last few months, we've only learned the extent of this sabotage, and it's quite extraordinary. It's essentially, it was a cyber attack that some kind of worm or virus hit Iran's the controlling computers of its nuclear facilities, particularly the one where they enrich uranium, and it looks like it disabled some 20% of the centrifuges that were spinning in Iran. They were taken out of service, and the IAEA documented this. The IAEA found that nearly like a year or so ago, that nearly 1,000 of these centrifuges had been taken out of service. No explanation was offered to the IAEA at that time, but since, we've had newspaper reports about something called the Stuxnet worm. And just a couple of weeks ago, there was a big piece in the Sunday New York Times on the front page, essentially asserting that this was an initiative of the United States and Israel, possibly with help from Great Britain and Germany. And it was some kind of a worm that could attack the computers that control these facilities, built by Siemens, and that it has been effective, not 100% effective, but significantly effective. I think what we may have learned is the evidence of the first significant cyber attack or attack in cyberspace in history. And it's quite extraordinary, and it's got the Iranians unnerved. They've denied that it was as significant or as extensive as it was. And now there is even newer information within the last couple of weeks that not only this uranium enrichment facility in Natanz in Iran, but the one nuclear power plant that Iran has that has been built by the Russians and is nearly complete at a place called Bushehr on the Persian Gulf, may also be vulnerable to this attack and could melt down. So the story goes, like the Chernobyl reactor in 1986. So this raises all sorts of new questions about how Iran's adversaries, and we count the United States among them, can work to prevent Iran from gaining the technology necessary to make a nuclear weapon, and if it can be done in cyberspace. I mean, this is only the beginning or the first salvo in this story. It's a fascinating story, and I think we're going to learn more about it over time. And I think that it's worth asking ourselves, what if, in fact, the Bush administration had attacked Iran after going to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, had taken on Iran as well? Where would we be then, as opposed to where we are now, with trying to contain and perhaps destroy by other means Iran's nuclear program? I think that it's not easy to answer that question, and there are many answers to that question. It's reasonable to debate that matter, but it's an entirely different case now from the Iraq case and the North Korean case that I was talking about earlier. It makes the issue of sanctions and whether to use military action to challenge states that seek nuclear weapons or seek the technology to make nuclear weapons. It just challenges the whole debate, it seems to me, that has come before. And it's another reason to slow down, look with sober eyes on what we do know about Iran and its nuclear activities, and not give in to fears of the moment, but take a good, sober look at this before the public supports any kind of radical action that the leaders of our country may be contemplating. Anyway, that's the context, and that's what I wanted to tell you about. I mean, I find these issues really interesting, and as we all know, as a result of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, it can be a matter of life and death for Americans. So it's the kind of thing that we really need to pay a lot of attention to. I think probably I've talked myself enough, and that we ought to get some questions, and I'll do my best to respond or argue as the case may be.
There are two microphones. There's one there, and there's one over here. There's a question right here.
Right here. I don't know that I need a mic. But first of all, thank you for coming, sir. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Wouldn't someone like Henry Kissinger pretty easily explain why Iran thinks they need nuclear weapons, much like you explained why North Korea, relative to deterrence, needs them? Could you comment on realpolitik and the role that plays in Iran's thinking?
Yeah, I could give you an example, I think, an interesting example. In 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq, the president of Iran was a liberal, a reformer named Mohammad Khatami. And he was at odds with the more hardline clerical and military leaders of Iran. And Khatami wanted an interaction, clearly, with the Clinton administration before Clinton left office, and then with the United States, even during the early years of the Bush administration. And but they were rebuffed by Bush. They weren't rebuffed by Clinton, but the hardliners, the hardline conservatives in Tehran in the late 90s didn't want the reformist-oriented President Khatami to gain credit for improving relations with the United States. So it went nowhere during Clinton, and it went nowhere during the first years of the Bush administration. So the Bush administration invades Iraq, and in 3 weeks Saddam Hussein is overthrown. And by May of 2003, the Iranians are just freaked. the Iranian leadership is just shaking that the Bush administration will send American troops into Iran. The reason that we know this is because the Khatami administration in Tehran put on the table a grand bargain with the United States. They put everything that was a problem, including the nuclear issue, in a document on the table and asked to negotiate with the United States in order to end the state of affairs, the hostile state of affairs between Iran and the United States, and find a way of living better together. The Bush administration received this document via the Swiss embassy in Tehran. The Swiss embassy represents the United States' interest in Tehran because, as you know, there hasn't been diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran since 1980. So essentially this paper gets faxed to the Swiss embassy and they pass it along to the State Department, and President Bush ignores it. They do nothing. They do absolutely nothing because I think in retrospect now, they thought there was nothing to be done. The United States had won the war, destroyed Saddam Hussein, destroyed in 3 weeks the leader and the government of a nation that Iran had fought to a standstill for 8 years in the 1980s, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of people on both sides. And there was no clear winner to that war. That was the enemy that the United States defeated in 3 weeks. And you can see where if you were trying to calculate this in Tehran, you might think that they were next. And I think, in fact, there were many in the Bush administration who wanted them to be next. So the Bush administration didn't respond to this overture. Events continued to take place in the spring and summer of 2003 in Iraq. And by August, it was clear that there was a serious insurgency that was challenging the American presence in Iraq. There was a bombing at the facilities of the UN. Their leadership were killed. There were a number of other bombings. And all of a sudden, the situation looked completely different to Tehran. It looked like the United States was getting into a quagmire quickly. And essentially, we have written analysis from pundits in Iran who said that as that year went on, 2003, and it became clear that the United States was not going to have an easy time of it in Iraq, that the Iranians gained confidence that they weren't going to be in the American crosshairs, that the United States had its hands full in Iraq for the time being. And they gained, the hardliners in particular, gained a certain, I don't know, I think a certain smugness about what the United States had stepped into in Iraq, and stopped being interested in discussing all the serious issues between the United States and Iraq. And then in 2005, 2 years later, when the United States was really deep into it in Iraq, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president of Iraq. This was a hardliner coming to power after 8 years of reformers trying to reform the Iranian system and being checkmated at every turn. And that's the situation that we end up in today. So there was a moment that didn't last long, a window of opportunity where the United States and Iran might have come to some kind of accommodation that would have satisfied both sides. But we missed it, and it's not clear how another one can come to be or come about. Who else? Yes?
My premise with sanctions is that they affect those who you don't want to affect, such as the general population. When we cut off food in Iraq, the general population was the one hurting. Saddam Hussein, he had his food, but nobody else did. My hypothesis on that is that that is what we're trying to do, is affect and hurt those who we say we don't want to, in order to cause an internal uprising to overthrow the dictator. I wonder if you could comment on that.
That's an interesting hypothesis. I don't think that it's true, but it could be true. I mean, it's conceivable. I'm not sure that American leaders are as Machiavellian as that. This was an aspect of the Iraqi case that I actually meant to touch on. The initial sanctions really did hurt the Iraqi public. The oil embargo that was put on Iraq in 1991, and into the second Clinton administration, it really did help to impoverish the Iraqi general population, and I think equally significant, it concentrated wealth and power in Saddam Hussein's hands and the hands of his cronies in a way that actually they didn't have control of the economy before. Before, he was a dictator, but he didn't have control of all the money from the revenue from oil sales by Iraq. There was a budget, and there were different ministries, and it functioned similarly to governments around the world. When the sanctions were imposed and the oil embargo was imposed, essentially this concentrated economic power in the hands of Saddam and his cronies, because they dominated the smuggling. Basically, it became a smuggling-dominated economy. Oil was smuggled out of the country into Jordan and into Turkey. And all the stuff that Iraq didn't produce but had to import, from automobiles and refrigerators to cigarettes and whiskey, was smuggled into the country through Turkey, and largely through Turkey and Jordan. And Saddam and his circle became fabulously wealthy because they controlled all those profits. They became, I think, much more akin to a mafia controlling a state. This made it even more difficult for the Iraqi people. And in the second Clinton administration, they tried to create what they were calling smart sanctions. There were some political scientists and theorists who said there are a way of targeting these sanctions so that they don't hurt the population, but they hurt Saddam and those around him. And I'm not sure that was ever a success. I think that the jury is out on whether there is really smart sanctions that can separate the leadership from the populace if it's a more general embargo or trade embargo. If there are specific sanctions that say this leader of the military or this leader of the defense ministry can't travel, we're going to freeze bank accounts connected to him, stuff like that. That's one thing. But a more generalized trade embargo that seeks to isolate a state like that inevitably hurts the population. And I think that you're right in one sense that there's at least been a discussion recently about sanctions against Iran. And I've heard it argued by some that let's sanction the country, make it bite, because that will anger more people, particularly in Iran, because there's been so much turmoil in the streets, so much hostility to the government in Iran expressed by people, that this may get them back out in the streets and get them revive their instinct to challenge the government. That may in fact be the case. I don't know. I don't think that the sanctions have been as effective in the Iranian case as either the Bush White House or the Obama White House has claimed. Yeah?
Schuster, thank you for being a resource. I'm just curious, when you look back in history over the last 30, 40 years, at the arms race, the Soviet Union and the U.S. had, 20, 30,000 nuclear weapons each. How do you evaluate the nature of that threat to the threats posed today by the country you're talking about right now?
Well, it's obvious that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons now, and even if it did, it would have a handful, and the North Koreans only have a handful. And we were talking about tens of thousands of nuclear weapons in the Soviet-American Cold War. The good part is that the longer we are, the further away from the end of the Cold War we are, the more there is a serious discussion about the utility of nuclear weapons at all, and the lower deployed nuclear weapons on both sides, that is in Russia and in the United States, the lower they go. And we've seen just at the end of last year a successful negotiation and ratification of a new START treaty, a new strategic arms reduction treaty, that mandates that both the United States and Russia get down to 1,500 deployed nuclear weapons. And these are the nuclear weapons that can be used by intercontinental ballistic missiles or submarines or long-range bombers. So we're getting the most dangerous, most threatening weapons down. Now, 1,500 may seem like a lot, but compared to the height of the Cold War during the Reagan era, when there were 10,000 of those on each side deployed, or roughly that, you can see that progress has been made. It's been slow and painstaking and fitful, because the Bush administration was less interested in that kind of arms agreement with Russia than the Democrats either before or after him. And now the Obama administration is talking about putting other really key issues involving the nuclear arsenals of both Russia and the United States on the table, like tactical nuclear weapons, which are smaller, potentially more dangerous because they can be stolen or moved. Russia has them deployed, we believe, in order to protect the borders of Russia in the last instance. The United States hasn't deployed them. The United States withdrew them from deployment a long time ago, but they're still in storage. And when things like that are in storage, there is a certain level of vulnerability that everyone has to worry about. But this is the first time in many years that an administration has taken another step to reduce long-range nuclear weapons deployed by both the United States and Russia, and it's a good sign. And then the debate has also changed. You may have heard that Henry Kissinger and Sam Nunn and Bill Perry and George Shultz have come together in the last couple of years to write op-ed pieces. They've taken a position that going for zero nuclear weapons is what they're committed to now. It was a surprise step by these four very, very much Cold Warriors during the height of the Cold War, that they've come to the conclusion that now is the time to begin this de-escalation to zero. There are others that don't agree with them, but it's a significant step that voices like that have associated themselves with the desire to go to zero nuclear weapons. And everyone who pays close attention to this knows that even if it gets done, it's going to be years before it does get done. But the Obama administration argues that it's essential for the United States and Russia to take steps like that in order to be credible when they take a position that Iran has no right to nuclear weapons, North Korea has no right to nuclear weapons, other states that may be seeking nuclear weapons surreptitiously don't have that right. So these things are interlocked. Up here? Is your hand up? There's a mic.
I was just working.
Yes?
I can't tell. Anyways, I was wondering, with these sanctions, I don't know how common these sanctions are, but especially in this time of economic recession, how does it affect the global economy? And the growth of these third world countries is probably being inhibited by these sanctions. How is this affecting the economy at large, as opposed to just those countries in particular?
Well, if you're talking about an impact on the global economy, I don't think that sanctions against North Korea or Iran have any effect on the global economy. Sanctions on Iran, there's an argument as to how effective they are, but it's possible that they could. Iran's economy is not in good shape. They suffer from high unemployment and high inflation. Their currency has sort of wobbled a lot as new economic sanctions, particularly in the banking sector, have been imposed by the United States. They make a lot of money in Iran on the sale of oil. And one of the goals now on the part of the United States is to try and make it difficult for the Iranians to get those oil revenues into their banking system. They need the help of international banks in order to do that, because their banks don't function internationally the way Americans do, or European banks do, or even Asian banks do. So they have trouble. They need partners in order to suck the revenues from all the oil they sell every day into their system. So they need help from the international banking system, and the United States has tried to put pressure on the international banking system not to help them. And the most recent sanctions that the United States announced last year were meant to prevent foreign banks, particularly in Europe and in Asia, from facilitating the movement of oil money into Iran. And the way the United States does that essentially is to sanction or penalize banks from Europe or Asia that might do that in order to force those banks to choose. You either do business with Iran or you do business with us, but you can't do business with both. And the Treasury Department penalized to the tune of about $500 million a Swiss bank, Credit Suisse, last year, as an example to the international banking world that the United States is willing to take that kind of a step. But so far, it's been largely the United States without across-the-board support from other banks in Europe or elsewhere. And the United States, the Treasury has had a hard time convincing other banks to cooperate. Should those other banks cooperate, it would present a real difficult problem for the Iranians. But, you know, there are so many banks and there's so much money involved. Recently, there's been a spike in oil prices that the barrel of oil has gone from $70, $75 a barrel to over $100 a barrel over the course of the last few months. This is a windfall for a state like Iran. We're talking about 25, 30% more revenue in the last few months for the Iranians than before. It's a very, very difficult problem, and it's a very difficult one to organize effectively.
Question over here.
Yes.
The United States has a history of telling the world that certain nations can have nuclear weapons and other nations can't. We obviously think that we have the right to have them, and we even helped develop nuclear weapons in places like India and Israel. So my question is, well, I guess if you could just comment on that and our right or lack thereof to tell states that they can or cannot have nuclear weapons. And in addition, how do you think that can affect the effectiveness, I guess, of sanctions with the United States that we implement and even diplomacy and stuff like that?
All right, I'll do my best to touch on all the things that you raised. Because it's very much a legitimate question, and there's a clear answer to the issues that you raised. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is the treaty in international law that prevails across the board on this subject. And most of the nations of the world have signed on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear weapons states. But the NPT, as it's known, which was written and ratified in the late 60s or around about 1970, allows for 5 states and 5 states only to be nuclear weapon states, the states that had nuclear weapons at the time. The treaty was meant to stop the spread of nuclear weapons beyond those 5 states, and it couldn't get the support of the 5 nuclear weapon states if the treaty said they had to disarm. So, because the United States, the Soviet Union, China, France, and Great Britain had no interest in giving up their nuclear weapons in 1968 or 1970. So a deal was made in this treaty, and that's that it appealed to all the rest of the nations of the world to join the treaty in the legal status of non-nuclear weapon states. And it allowed for these 5 states that had nuclear weapons to be the only nuclear weapon states within the treaty. But there was also a clause which required them to, over time, get rid of their nuclear weapons. And that was a commitment that the 5 states that had nuclear weapons at the time were willing to make, and all the other nations of the world were willing to sign on, assuming that the 5 nuclear weapon states would eventually give up their nuclear weapons. There were a few states that stayed out of the treaty. India, Pakistan, and Israel never signed the treaty. They are not members of the NPT. And they don't want to be members of the NPT because they developed their nuclear weapons independent of that whole process. And for the time being, they believe in nuclear weapons and that nuclear weapons are essential to their defense. You can argue about that, but that's what they believe. The United States, as far as I know, did not help either India, or Israel gain nuclear weapons. In the case of Pakistan, the United States, especially President Reagan, overlooked evidence that Pakistan was acquiring a nuclear weapon when there was plenty of evidence to believe that they were. The French helped with the early nuclear program in Israel, and ultimately the Israelis in the 60s resorted to subterfuge. They invited some representatives from the Kennedy administration to look and inspect their facilities in the Negev desert at a place called Dimona, and they only let them see a portion of it, and they convinced the Americans who went there that they weren't making nuclear weapons, when in fact they were. They deceived the United States, but when it finally became clear that they had created a small nuclear arsenal in Israel, the United States has never challenged that. So in that sense, the United States has helped Israel diplomatically maintain what the Israelis consider to be nuclear ambiguity about their capacity. Now there's, as I said in the treaty, there's this link, and it has, the United States, different administrations have used that link in the treaty to argue that states like Iran and North Korea should not be permitted legally to gain nuclear weapons because they signed the treaty and went into the treaty. The North Koreans did, I think, in the early 1990s. I forget which year the Iranians joined, but it was years ago. And as long as they're inside the treaty, any state has a legitimate interest in demanding that they live up to the terms of the treaty. The North Koreans, when they decided they wanted to make it clear to the world they had nuclear weapons, they withdrew from the treaty. And like all treaties, there's a withdrawal mechanism, and the North Koreans withdrew. They said, we don't want to be part of this treaty anymore. We have nuclear weapons. We don't want nuclear inspectors. We want to do what we want to do. The Iranians have not gone that far. Iran is still a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and still has a safeguard agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency and doesn't want to take that step. Because when they take the step to withdraw from the treaty, it alerts the whole world as to what they're doing. They try to cheat and stay within the treaty, but they've been exposed by the inspections of the IAEA. And so they're in a difficult place. And it makes sense to me, at any rate, that the United States and its allies would want to put pressure on a situation like Iran's to get it to live up to the commitment that it's made, or to break clearly with the treaty, which would send a whole set of different diplomatic signals and require a different approach, I think. Yes, here? How are we doing on time? Okay, good.
I think there's a certain amount of irony in the fact that we helped the Iranians during the 70s with the Sanctions. We helped them with a research reactor. And of course, the Shah, during his megalomania, wanted to set up all these nuclear reactors all over the country. And it was Khomeini, really, who decided that we don't need nuclear energy and we don't need the bomb. Now, I'd like you to talk a little bit about whether you think, one, do the Iranians really want to make a nuclear weapon? And two, whether we eventually, if they do, will have to learn to live with it, as we did with India and Pakistan. And if
Well, I don't think there's enough evidence in public, understood in the public domain, for us to say that they want nuclear weapons. There's certainly enough evidence that they want to enrich uranium, and they want the technology that's capable of enriching uranium, and it's a key step toward nuclear weapons. They, of course, deny that they want to produce highly enriched uranium for bombs. They claim they want to only produce low-enriched uranium for nuclear power plants, even though they don't have any functioning nuclear power plants at the moment. And the one that's nearly completed will use nuclear fuel from Russia and will send the spent fuel back to Russia. So the uranium that they're enriching now has no use anywhere in Iran for the time being. And that raises questions in a lot of people's minds, particularly more suspicious minds, about what they want to do. But I think the key question is whether the Iranian leadership has made a decision to go for the bomb, and what they're willing to do in order to go that far. And I don't think there's any evidence that they've actually done that. And it's not, It's not just me. I mean, I listen to all the arguments that go back and forth about this issue, and I think that it's to be as careful as possible in this. I think it's fair to say that we don't know, and the CIA does not know, because they've said so, that the Iranian leaders have made the decision necessary to go for the bomb. They could in the future, but they haven't done it so far. The other part of your question was?
Well, if they did,
Uh-huh.
would we have to learn eventually?
Well, I think if they did, I mean, the discussion about what to do about it has been somewhat simplistic over the last few years, and hasn't taken the tools of deterrence and containment seriously enough. We went through something of the same discussion about North Korea, and North Korea has bombs and is making more, and will probably, over time, make better bombs that explode more powerfully, and may ultimately, they may figure out how to make them smaller and put them into nose cones of missiles. And the only thing left for the United States to do is to deter them so that they never use their weapons and contain them. We did that with a much larger and far more threatening state during the Cold War for a really long time, and we did it successfully. So there's no reason, it seems to me, not to take deterrence and containment seriously as potential tools. And I think that naturally falls in the case of Iran as well. But there are complicating factors. And those who argue for more robust response to Iran's potential acquiring of nuclear weapons have a point when they raise the question, could Iran share the bomb with Hezbollah in Lebanon? Would they be willing to turn it over to surrogates in other parts of the Middle East that might use it against the United States or Israel? Will we know if a bomb explodes in Tel Aviv or a bomb explodes in Iraq or even in New York, in a van or in a boat? Will we know where it came from? Whose fingerprints are on it? These are difficult questions. They're not easy to answer. And simply saying containment and deterrence will work, I think those who favor those tools, and that's significant, have to address the more complicated issue like that. Now, issues like that came up with the Soviet Union as well. And it's fairly clear that the Soviets, let's put it this way, they were more responsible with their nuclear weapons than that. But I think those are the kind of questions that we'll be increasingly forced to ask ourselves.
I just had one quick question. Did they hear me? No? Yes. I can't hear you. Well, as I'm listening, I'm just wondering as the politicians and the military are playing Star Wars games and blasting each other to Kingdom Come, I'm wondering where the innocent people are in this and what organizations are in place, because my family's from the former Yugoslavia, from Serbia, and I went in 2009 and heard stories and have seen just the suffering, the devastation, and even being born as an American citizen to see where the United States had bombs and where I was sleeping next to bullet holes that were performed by the U.S. And I'm just wondering, as they're playing these games, are they aware of just the innocent and the suffering of what's going on, and what organizations are there to help with the innocent that had nothing to do with that?
Well, this is not a question that I can really answer. I mean, I'm not privy to what either Cold Warriors or those that have come after them really think about nuclear weapons. I'm inclined to think that Stanley Kubrick got it partially right in Dr. Strangelove. But I can't say for sure.
So you don't know what organizations are in place to help as the sanctions create pain and suffering to innocent people?
I think that rather than my answering that, it's very easy to find a whole range of organizations that concern themselves with these issues just by Googling nuclear disarmament, and you'll find lots and lots of food for thought, places to go to get information, to interact with activists, that kind of thing. But that's not my realm. As a journalist, that's not my realm. So last question? Yes.
Okay, don't sanctions provide a pretty convenient rally point for the disenchanted in a country like Iran for the regime to point at and say the Americans are causing all of your economic suffering and not our regime, which would make, I don't know, a situation like what's going on in Egypt completely impossible in Iran?
Yes, that's in fact true. I think that the government of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has tried to make that argument and has tried to argue to the Iranian public that sanctions have made us stronger. This is what the United States is, this is where the United States is willing to go to cause suffering in Iran. And I think that has some resonance. But Iran is I know one thing for sure about Iran. It is a society in political flux. It is not a simple place. There are many very well-educated people in Iran who understand what Ahmadinejad is doing when he's making that argument, and understand what the United States is doing when it's carrying out the policies that it's carrying out. I think many of those in the opposition in Iran are thankful that the United States has not attacked Iran, because they fear that that would do more to bring together disparate factions or contending political factions in Iran than almost anything. Nationalism is strong in Iran, and an attack on Iran is an attack on all. And that would do a lot, they argue, and it makes sense to me, to bolster the flagging fortunes of the Mahmoud Ahmadinejad administration. So yes, I agree with you. The issue of sanctions and their impact politically on a place like Iran is very complicated. Thank you. I'm going to sit down, okay?
Thank you very much. It was very, very enlightening and very, very informational. We really appreciate you coming to talk to our group. If you'd like more information on this topic or a complete guide of the topics for this season, we have the Great Decisions books out in the lobby as well. Next week's topic ties all of our Great Decisions topics together. Call it what you will: global governance, multilateralism, or how to rule the world. Whatever you call it, it's becoming a buzz policy topic. Join us to listen to Dr. Stuart Patrick. He is from the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., and his talk on Needed, a New World Order. Plan to join us. Thank you very much. Drive safely. We'll see you next week.